process. They'd invited the Electoral Commission themselves to oversee their own election process. But the point is, this was just, I saw a sneak, just a tiny peek, if you like, at a process which is happening across Latin America, a continent which was first hit by neoliberalism before many other countries were hit, and was also amongst the first to fight back. And we see it with other governments in Latin America, like Ecuador and Bolivia. And they give us all hope, because you can look at that as an example, if you like, of people who fought back, fought for democracy, but fought for an alternative to the failed, catastrophic neoliberal agenda. So it's so important for me that we don't look at Latin America as something that's just happening elsewhere, but it's something which gives us all hope. And the way the oligarchs, the oligarchs are furious there. I spoke to one of the Chavez's ministers, and he said the reason they were so angry is because the people who cleaned their houses were now politically more important than them. And that's what it's done, it's mobilised people. And I think as much as fighting against a coherent alternative, actually mobilising people to feel actively part of the democratic process is something which was inspiring too. Now, just in terms of this country, and where I see the struggle, I suppose, firstly in terms of where we're up against, on every single count, austerity in this country has failed. And it has failed on its own terms. Everything we warned about has come to pass. I mean, not that we can take any joy from that, given the human consequences of austerity. When it comes to growth, when it comes to borrowing, now hurtling up as tax receipts decline, as demand is sucked out of the economy. But just to talk about those human consequences, because we're now going through the biggest squeeze, sustained squeeze, in living standards since my gran was born in the early 1920s. The Resolution Foundation projects that by 2020, if you're in the bottom 10%, you're going to be 15% poorer than you are now. As an unprecedented squeeze and decline in the living standards of the poorest people in society. Save the Children have done this huge study where they've looked at people, they spoke to parents and children, and they found parents having to choose between heating their own homes and feeding their kids, skipping their own meals in order to make sure their kids were fed. In schools, the size of meals, school meals, is now being cut back because of cuts to the overall budget. We're seeing breakfast clubs being closed as well. We're the 7th richest country on earth, and apparently we can't even afford to feed our poorest children. It is a damning indictment of Cameron's Britain. And we're seeing as well, we talk about jobs, the official unemployment figures, 2.6 million. Scrap that. As the TUC pointed out a few months ago, you take into account people forced to do part-time work because they can't get full-time work, and other economically inactive people. There's over 6 million people in this country looking for full-time work who can't get it. Now, the point we have to make is this. It doesn't have to be this way. Because our biggest enemy, in many ways, is resignation. It's a lack of confidence in an alternative to what this government is doing. You often meet people, I'm sure you all do, you meet people and they're angry and they're scared about the future. But they equally feel there is no alternative to what is happening. So that is why we have to inspire that confidence in alternative. Now, working with a think tank set up by Unite and other trade unions called Class, and one of the things that's trying to do is bring together economists and academics, other experts, and not to be just another bloody think tank, which is probably what many of you are thinking, but to link it as well to the experiences of working people, which of course only a trade union can do. But I'll just talk quickly about a few ideas about an alternative that gives people hope. Now, we hear a lot about welfare spending, about how high it is. To be honest with you, the government have a point in a way. It's not to do with a bunch of scroungers, though, as the right-wing press would have it. It's to do with a triple crisis. It's to do with the housing crisis, the low wages crisis, and the jobs crisis. Now, the government are right. Billions of pounds of taxpayers' money is being wasted on housing benefit. It's about £21 billion a year. But that's not lining the pockets of tenants. It's going straight to wealthy landlords who are charging extortionate rents because successive governments failed to build council housing and because of the abolition of any rent controls back in 1988. So this should be our argument. Instead of wasting the billions on housing benefit, let's build council housing, which will create jobs, it'll stimulate the economy, it'll bring down the welfare bill, it'll also bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list in this country. And tax credits, which you were talking about, again, a lifeline for millions of people in this country. But we should be clear about what they are. They're a subsidy for low pay because businesses aren't paying their workers properly. So we call for a living wage. If we even just increased it by £1, that would not only bring down again the tax credits bill, but it would be a huge stimulus for our economy. Because as we know, whilst the rich, when they get more money, they go and stuff it somewhere in the Cayman Islands, poorer people tend to spend it, injecting demand back in our economy, which again is exactly why we oppose the economically disastrous freeze on the pay, not freeze, real term decline, cut in the pay of nurses, of teachers, of bin collectors, and other pillars of our society. What we need to be talking about, again, is the jobs crisis. And Keynes said in the 30s, if you look after the jobs, the unemployment queues, then the deficit will sort itself out. Something else we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about the banks. Now, we nationalised the debts and we've privatised the profits. The reality is we don't have proper control over what the banks we all bailed out, what they actually do. So we need to be calling for proper democratic control of our banks, a national public investment bank which can actually spearhead investment in our economy. We'll link it to an industrial strategy, creating hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs, so-called green-collar jobs, just like they've done in Germany. We need to be arguing loudly to clamp down on tax avoidance. We hear a lot about benefit fraud, and we know it happens. It's worth less than 1% of welfare spending, according to the government's own figures. It's £1.2 billion a year. But compare that to tax avoidance by the people at the top, £25 billion. The likes of Philip Green, who was rewarded by this government for his tax avoidance by being made an advisor on how to slash our public services. He has registered his own company under his wife's name in Monaco, so he doesn't have to pay taxes. So we call for that, instead of kicking people at the bottom, to make people at the top pay, and to argue for more progressive taxation. Because let's not forget, one of the most popular policies of the last government was the 50p tax. Even a majority of Conservative voters, according to the polls, oppose the scrapping of that tax. And I think all of these things together, if we start talking about those ideas, I think they're pretty common sense, to be honest with you. They talk about the deficit, but they talk about growth, and they talk about jobs. They basically argue that instead of paying the deficit off the back of working people, the poor, the disabled people, and so on, and women, and the poorest generally in society, we pay it off the backs of those at the top. We pay it off by focusing on creating jobs and creating a more equal society. Because as we know, inequality, as tax credits show, actually costs money. And I think if we do that, if we argue for that, then we can actually give people confidence to fight back. That's what this demonstration is about on the 20th. It's a show of force to show people that are desperate for an alternative, crying out for one. But we need to be there organising and showing what that alternative is and explaining it. Now, we're doing quotes. One of my favourite quotes is Frederick Douglass, who was an African-American statesman in the 19th century. He's a freed slave. And he said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." Absolutely true. We only change society by organising from below with clear demands that give us confidence, but also to force the people at the top, whether they like it or not, to offer concessions. That is how struggle takes place. And finally, we do, and I'm glad Aaron and others talked about this, we have to draw confidence and inspiration from victories. Often on the left we have a bit of a habit of bashing ourselves and talking about how, we're going to be honest, many defeats over the last 30 years. But we have to talk about struggles which are successful. One of the most inspiring things I've done in the last year, I went up to Leeds and I spoke to bin collectors who went on strike in 2009. It was a Lib Dem Conservative coalition that tried to impose a 30% pay cut on them. And they refused to take it. And they went on strike for over 2 months. They turned up at picket lines at 5 AM in the morning in freezing cold November weather. And they won. And examples like that, or the electricians, those who took on Balfour Beatty, Unite members, again, they won. We look at UK Uncut, which forced the issue of tax avoidance on the agenda in the first place. These show that struggles from people, ordinary people, working people, fighting power and wealth can be successful. So we bear that in mind, and as we build up to this demonstration, and the second one on the 21st of November, I think this should be our message as a movement. We stand together. we fight together.